First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be able to travel around the world and see that even though we're separated by great geographical distances, we still all can get together with our appreciation of Python programming language. So this is a talk about CPython governance. And because CPython is the reference implementation of Python, that is the implementation where all new features are first added and where language design happens, this is also a talk about the governance of the Python programming language. So this became a very interesting topic to people recently in the last year or so because there was a dramatic shift. Maybe probably you heard Guido stepped down as the benevolent dictator for life. So I'm going to talk about that and the changes that brought to the project. But I also want to make sure to present a holistic picture of how CPython governance has evolved over the last decades. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Python project, what the current state is, and even tender a few speculations about what the future might hold for governance with CPython and the future of the language. So, but before I dive into that, Guido says hello. He likes to hear about far-flung Python conferences and is happy to hold signs. And a little bit about me. So, I've been a CPython core developer for 11 years since last Wednesday. And I've worked on all over the language in the standard library and broken most of it. I'm not really a implementer of very big fancy features. I prefer to do things like make sure that the interpreter doesn't segfault. Like probably the most fancy thing I ever implemented was the multiplication operator, so the @ the matrix multiplication operator. I implemented that. And I've also worked on various parts of the CPython project which are not the language themselves, like documentation and project infrastructure. Outside of CPython directly, I wrote the 6 library, which is a Python 2 and 3 compatibility library, which is pretty widely used. If you don't have it as at least a transitive dependency, you're probably in a really happy world where you're only using Python 3, right? And it turns out that all that open source stuff doesn't really pay the bills, so my day job is working at Dropbox on developer tools, which includes the use of Python at Dropbox. So let's dive into the topic of this talk, starting with a little bit of the history of Python programming language. So I said I've been a core developer for 11 years. That feels like a very long time to me, but in terms of a Python scale, it's not really all that long. Python is a very old project at this point. Guido says that he came up with the first idea for it in December of 1989. And at the time, he was working at a Dutch research institute called Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, or CWI as an acronym. And if you go and look at CWI's website, on their About page, they'll see, like the first paragraph is how proud they are that the Python programming language was invented there, which is a little funny because Guido was not supposed to be inventing a programming language when he was working at CWI. He was supposed to be working on an experimental operating system project called Amoeba. And Amoeba was a very ambitious project. It was like microkernels, you know, it was going to solve all the terrible operating system problems. And Python was initially used within the Amoeba project at CWI to automate tasks, just like we use Python today. So Amoeba obviously did not do so well, but Python turned out to be pretty popular. And so Guido publicly released it to the world at large in 1991 by publishing a tarball which had been segmented into 21 different pieces and sending it to a mailing list, which is what you did in those days. And so, remember, this is a very long time ago. So this is like 5 years even before the term open source had been invented. I was very early in the days of public collaboration on software. And so Python proved to be pretty popular outside of CWI too. And because of the popularity of the language, Guido was invited to join a place called CNRI in the United States in Virginia in 1995. So he moved to the United States, and there he and a few other core developers worked on Python. Eventually, they moved on from CNRI to a bunch of short-lived startups. So this was 2000s, the dot-com boom. These include beopen.com and the Zope Corporation. So the Zope Corporation was, of course, the developers of the Zope web framework, which is still with us, but was sort of considered to be Python's killer app at the time. And so it was a very optimistic time. Everyone thought you could make a company out of anything, but that didn't actually work out so well. So these companies were very short-lived, and sort of by the end of 2001, most of the core developers had dispersed across other companies. One thing which I found very interesting about the history of Python, or in its first 10 years, was even in the early history, people were really worried about what would happen if Guido went away. So there's this mailing list thread. Unfortunately, the bottom of this slide is cut off, but most of the quote is there, which is about the title was, if it was Guido was hit by a bus, and here the author says they were meeting with some business people who were interested in using Python, but they didn't want to use it because they were worried that Python would go away if Guido was hit by a bus or just lost interest in a less violent manner. And they were also worried that Python couldn't be used in business because it didn't have a international standard. So this email said, maybe we need to go to the ISO and write up a standard for Python, like there is for C++ or Java. So it turns out the author of this email probably didn't need to worry, because Guido stuck around for another 20 years, and Python flourished even in businesses without having a backing standard. But it's very interesting to see that people were worrying about this even in the early history of Python. And if you want to know more about Python's early history, I recommend this blog, python-history.blogspot.com. And this has a bunch of blog posts about Guido, about the early years of the language, including fundamental language designs, but also some of this social history. There's a lot more to learn. Around 2000, we got sort of one of the main features of Python governance that we know today, which is the Python Enhancement Proposal, or PEP. And a PEP is an explanation of a major feature or policy change in the Python language or the CPython project. So a good PEP is supposed to provide a rationale for why a change should be made, a good specification for that change, and also an exploration of different possibilities that could also solve the problem that the PEP is solving, but why those should be rejected in favor of the PEP. And so once a PEP is written, traditionally it's been subject to review and acceptance or rejection by Guido as the benevolent dictator for life. But more recently, we've also had something called a BDFL delegate. And a BDFL delegate is someone who is chosen by Guido and is given delegated authority to accept or reject a particular PEP. And this has been used historically for areas which Guido is not quite as experienced in, or where someone else has clear expertise or more ownership in an area where they should be making the decision. So probably the most prominent example is packaging PEPs. So PEPs related to packaging, distutils, setup tools, and so forth, pip. are all delegated away from Guido. And the PEP has been a really successful innovation in governance. So in the last 19 years or so that PEPs have existed, there have been almost 500 written. And even besides Python, a lot of open source communities, other programming languages and so forth, have something which is, even if it's not called blank enhancement proposals, is quite like the PEP process. So that takes us up to today, where we see Python today. So there's no doubt that Python is a major programming language today. The TIOBE index, which tries to track the growth and popularity of programming languages by looking at the search terms that people are entering into search engines, once again gave Python its Language of the Year award in 2018, which means that it's the language that saw the most growth in 2018. So that's kind of a synthetic metric of language popularity, which doesn't tell the whole story. But what we also know is that Python is used in basically every domain of computing that you can imagine somewhere. So pretty much any company of any size now has some Python somewhere, and Python is used in everything from agriculture to machine learning to education to just gluing together shell scripts. And for being such a major language, I think Python is pretty unique in that CPython is a completely volunteer-driven project. So there are a few core developers, including Guido, who get a little segment of their work time from their employers to just work on CPython. But there are no people, to my knowledge, who are paid full-time to work on CPython. And this is a pretty different situation than many other languages at the top of the popularity list, like C++ or Java or JavaScript, which all have really big corporations behind them. So that's kind of the current state of the world and how everything was working until this guy came along. So this is what's affectionately known as the Walrus Operator. And the Walrus Operator is proposed in PEP 572, Assignment Expressions. So the Walrus Operator is a new way of assigning a value to a variable. And the key thing about this, how this is different from normal equals, is that you can do it within an expression. So Python traditionally has had a very strict separation between statements and expressions, and you haven't been able to assign variables in expressions. And PEP 572 came along to change that. So I think by looking at a few examples in the PEP, we can see what they were trying to accomplish by introducing the Walrus Operator. So here you have before and after. So we're trying to find this environmental variable called Python user base, and if it's set, return early from the function. So in the original code, you have to assign the end base variable before you can actually check that it exists and then return it. But under PEP 572 with assignment expressions, you can assign the end base variable and do the check for truthiness in the same line. So here you end up saving one line of code, which is perhaps not the most dramatic improvement. Where things get a little better is when you are able to replace really long nested if-else chains. So here we're trying to find a function called the reductor and then call it. And depending on where you find it, you have to call it with a different set of arguments. And this code is currently implemented using the sort of nested code you see on the left. So each time we have a fallback, we have to enter another nested else chain. And so by the time you get to the bottom with like the error case, you see the code even has to be wrapped because it's hitting the line length, even though the line isn't particularly long. And things look quite a lot better under PEP 572 on the right-hand side, where you can check for each of the cases of where the reductor function might be located. Within the condition statements, and then just immediately call it. So the code is quite a bit shorter, and it's less nested. So that's quite an improvement, I think. So how many of you think that PEP 572 is a good idea? Okay, a few people. Probably not half, though. So this was super controversial, partially just because it's syntax, and people feel very, very strongly about syntax, and also because it changes sort of a very long-standing behavior in Python's model, I guess. So people felt very strongly about this, and it probably would have not. This PEP probably would have gone nowhere if Guido van Rossum and Tim Peters did not sign on as co-authors of it. So Guido, of course, is Guido, and Tim Peters is the author of the Zen of Python. So that's a pretty formidable force in favor of this PEP. That did not stop people from trying to object to it, and sort of the result was on our project forums, our mailing lists, particularly Python Dev, and another mailing list called Python Ideas. There was massive sprawling discussions. There was thousands and thousands of messages. There was multiple postings of different pieces of feedback, and it got to the point where no one person could really read the entire discussion and understand what was going on. And because of that, the same thing was being posted over and over again. Even the PEP authors said at one point, we have to declare bankruptcy. We cannot see what is going on here. So that discussion got very, very unproductive. And even besides that, social media was sort of doing its job of bringing the worst out of humanity, and people are making very invidious and unkind comments about the PEP and its authors on things like Twitter. And so it all turned into a very, very messy situation. And sort of the culmination of all this was on June 12th, 2018, Guido sent an email to Python Dev saying, I'm taking a permanent vacation from being the BDFL, so you all have to figure out what your new governance model is going to be. So I think for many of us who have known Guido for a while, this wasn't a completely unexpected move. I remember going to a talk at PyCon 2008 where Guido said, I'm going to resign in 5 years. So he actually didn't resign for another 11 years, but I know he's been thinking about it for a very long time. And so he didn't quit just because of PEP 572, but I think it was a culmination of a lot of stress which he's been feeling about being on the critical decision path for what is now a global phenomenon, Python. And so the Python community really noticed this. Even the software engineering community at large took note of Guido stepping down because Python's governance model has been around for such a long time and is rather famous. Even the popular media was taking note. So my parents called me and said, "What happened to Guido?" They're not programmers, and my favorite article was this one in the English news magazine called The Economist, and The Economist is known for their very snarky style. So they wrote an article about Guido stepping down, and they said, Guido wasn't the Messiah, but he was a very clever boy. So this is about as nice as The Economist is to anyone. So that was a win. But the thing is, the sky did not fall in the Python world, right, when Guido stepped down. So people's Python programs continued to execute. Even in the CPython project, we continue to fix bugs. We continue to make releases. So Guido's, a lot of the things that Guido used to do in like 20 years ago, make releases and so forth, had been taken up by other people, and Python at large continued to function. Really the main thing that needed to be resolved was how do we make decisions in CPython and who is kind of going to be setting the vision for the language. And Guido kind of threw down the gauntlet for us. He said, I'm not going to tell you what your new governance model is going to be. You're going to have to figure it out. And being CPython developers, what we did is we wrote a bunch of PEPs. And then decided on one, which would be our future governance model. So I'm going to take you through a tour of all of the governance PEPs that were proposed so you can get an idea of what we were thinking about when we were doing this. So the first one is PEP 8002. So we made a whole new PEP namespace in the 8000s for PEPs. This was the Open Source Governance Survey. And this wasn't even a proposal for a new governance model. This was sort of an enumeration of all sorts of governance models, mostly in open source projects, but also from companies. So there's an explanation of how Microsoft makes decisions in there, for example. And what we were interested in knowing is how does leadership work in those projects? How do they resolve controversial decisions? That was a very important one because the PEP 572 discussions were all in the back of our minds, and we wanted to know if there were more scalable ways of handling those kinds of decisions. So this was just all background information for people who to understand pre-existing models of open source governance. The first actual proposal is one called 8010, the Technical Leader Governance Model. And the main figure in PEP 810 is someone called the Gracious Umpire Influencing Decisions Officer, which all sounds like word salad until you look at the acronym, which is Guido. And so from this you can probably tell that the Guido is supposed to be a replacement BDFL. And the way it would work under PEP 8010 is that the Guido would sort of have absolute authority over accepting and rejecting PEPs, but they would be elected for 5-year terms. And then there would also be an advisory council, which would help the Guido with certain difficult decisions. So this is kind of the most nostalgic governance proposal, the one which was about keeping things the same, close to the same as they were as possible. Then we have PEP 8011, the trio of Pythonistas. So this was actually a little bit like the technical leader governance model, except rather than one person, there were 3 people. And so the core developers would elect a group of 3 people who would have absolute authority over the project. And sort of the idea is rather than electing 3 separate people, you would be electing groups of 3 people who you thought would complement each other's strengths and weaknesses in decision making. Then there's PEP 8012, the community governance model. So this one was modeled on what the Rust language community does. And the basic idea is that different technical areas would be owned by self-selected working groups, and those self-selected working groups would accept or reject the PEPs which were happening in those areas. Then there was PEP 8013. This is a pretty interesting model, the external council model. In this case, there would be a steering council, which is elected by the core developers who are responsible for accepting and rejecting PEPs. But the key thing about this, the external part, is that the council members could not be core developers of CPython. So they would have to be people external to the project. And sort of the idea behind this was that because these people were not intimately familiar with how the Python language is developed, how it works, proposals which were made to them would have to be sufficiently detailed and convincing that even people who weren't part of the CPython project could be sufficiently convinced of their value. Then we have PEP 8014, the Commons Governance Model. So this was also called the Anarchy Model. And the reason is that anyone who wants to could vote on any PEP. And then there would also be a council of elders elected by the core developers who would not have any actual authority to accept or reject PEPs, but would be responsible for making sure that elections, votes on PEPs were fair. So this PEP is also interesting because it's written by a person named Jaak Janssen, who is Guido's office mate at CWI. So it gives you another sense of that there's people who've been within the project for 30 years at this point. PEP 8015, this is a lot like the community model in that there's Python teams who own specific areas and the PEPs within them. And then there's also a steering council, which is responsible for forming teams, disbanding them, and handling issues which don't fit within one particular area. And then there was PEP 8016, the steering council model. So I will be discussing that one more in a second. But once we had all these proposals, we had to decide on one. And the way you do that, of course, is voting. But that itself is a great meta discussion. It turns out programmers really like talking about voting methods. And the reason for that is that you can prove that there's no one perfect voting method. And so that means that everyone can choose their own favorite voting method, ranked choice or plurality or whatever, and then argue that its strengths and weaknesses are better than the other guys. So we had a fantastic meta discussion. We had many long threads about different voting methods, but we did finally decide on a voting method. We did finally vote, and the winner was the steering council, PEP 8016. And because it won, it got put in the place of honor at PEP 13 for good luck. And so a few details about the steering council. So this was considered to be the boring governance model. That's good, boring governance. It's very close to what the Django project does. And the basic layout of authority is that there's 5 members who are nominated and elected by core developers. And the committee, the council, serves for a single feature release. So in the Python world, that's incrementing the second number of the version. For example, 3.7 to 3.8 is a feature release. Under our current release schedule, that's about every 18 months. And in order to prevent one company or organization from taking too much power in the project, there's a rule that no 3 members of the steering council, so not a plurality, can be from the same company. And the steering council is sort of given ultimate authority. They can accept or reject PUS, add or remove core developers, and so forth. But the PEP encourages them to use these powers the least amount possible. Instead, steering council members are supposed to achieve a decision-making process through things like community discussion and trying to build consensus. So that's our new model. And of course, we had to elect a steering council. So we argued about the voting methods to how to elect the steering council first, and then we'd elected them. And the election had 67 voters, so 67 core developers decided to vote. A very large number of them were also candidates. So there were 17 candidates. So everyone voted, and then here's our first steering council. So you'll probably recognize the first name there. So Guido is still very much around. He's still very active in the project. He just doesn't want to have all the decision authority vested in him, but he's on the steering council now. And the rest of these people have also been in the project for a very long time and bring a lot of experience and knowledge and wisdom to the position in the steering council. So thankfully they did not elect me. I got the 6th number of votes, most number of votes. All right, so that's the steering council and our new governance model, which brings me to looking a bit into the future. So I have a few sort of miscellaneous topics about that. The first thing is that there's kind of a unresolved problem in Python and frankly the world at large about how to handle large-scale discussions. So we still don't know what the best way to handle things like PEP 572 assignment expressions is. But one of the things we wanted to try is moving away from mailing lists. So we thought maybe if we have better moderation tools and so forth, we can make discussions more productive and cut off unproductive ones. So we've been trying this tool called Discourse. So Discourse is kind of a fancy web forum thing. And all of the core developers have been using it for our sort of internal communications. It replaced a mailing list called Python committers. We had all of our governance discussions on Discourse, and it worked pretty well. It has a lot better moderation tools, so discussions which are unhelpful can be turned off, and new threads it's very easy to split new threads off when discussions fork. But it's still not clear that it solves our discussion problem, because we've only been using it for a group of people who number basically less than 100. So we don't know if it will solve large-scale discussions, but we're looking into technological improvements to our discussion technology. Another thing we're looking at changing is moving to using GitHub for our issues. So for about the last 13 years, Python has been using its own host issue tracker called Roundup. I think we're probably the only people in the world still using it at this point. And since we've moved our Git repositories to GitHub, we've also been thinking about moving our GitHub issues to GitHub issues, which should hopefully help with contributors who are more familiar with the GitHub interface. Yeah, so a note or two about Python 3. So the world is looking up for Python 3. So back in the early days of Python 3, 2012, 2013, 2014, and so forth, things sometimes felt a little grim, like it wasn't getting much attraction or adoption. People weren't porting their libraries and frameworks to Python 3, and everyone was just going to stay on Python 2. But things are looking a whole lot better now. Basically, any dependency you could possibly want has been ported to Python 3 now. People are all writing their new projects in Python 3, and the community has definitely moved to Python 3, which is good because I'm really, really sick of Python 2. So one of my jobs is to release Python 2.7, and I made Python 2.7.16 like last month, and I'm really, really getting sick of it. So we're going to stop making Python 2 releases in less than a year. 2020 is the year that Python 2 dies for upstream. And at that point, we're going to say a fond but very firm farewell to Python 2 and stop writing it. So I'm not the only person who's tired of Python 2. One of my favorite websites these days is this one called python3statement.org, which is a list of all dependencies, open source projects, which are going to drop their Python 2 support along with upstream in 2020. So you are almost surely using a library there. Basically, the entire scientific stack is going to drop Python 2 support, including TensorFlow, NumPy, SciPy, and all sorts of web frameworks. So the community is throwing off Python 2. So that's the open source world's doing very well. Now I know that a lot of companies are sitting on very large Python 2 code bases, legacy code bases. I know all about that, which would very, very well be Python 2 code bases in 5 years. But this makes me confident that in 5 years there'll also be large legacy Python 3 code bases. So success. The last thing about Python 3, though, is that I don't think we want to do that again. So it was a very good learning lesson for everyone in the CPython project about the value of backward compatibility, about the difficulty of updating every single piece of source code in the world. And I think that there's never going to be a breaking backward incompatible big release like Python 3, again, at least under the current people who are in charge of Python. Speaking of which, the Python language is now under the steering committee. Steering council, which should bring up in your mind like scary thoughts of design by committee, which is fair. Committees are famous for their conservative decision making or their design by compromise types of thinking, which is usually ends up being pretty mediocre. For example, I think it's very likely that PEP 572 would not have been accepted if the steering council was in place when it was proposed. So Python may not have quite the same design decisions anymore. But on the other hand, I think it's less important that the core language is getting flashy features all the time. So right now, the killer thing about Python is the great third-party ecosystem. So people start using Python because they're using Django or because they're using CPy. Or they're using one of the many other frameworks or libraries which people have built. And so the Python language is a core part of that, but it's not the reason that people start using it. And they may come up to appreciate Python, but the most important thing for the language now is maintaining the flourishing third-party ecosystem. And I don't think it's quite as important that the language evolve very quickly because it has most things that people want to do now. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It was very interesting. And any questions? Come on. Okay.
Do you want me to tell you what my favorite color is?
Yeah.
Hi again, thank you very much for your speech. You said that there were about 500 pips were written to this time, and but the numbers are even 8016, 8013. You said about the namespaces which are present in the enhancement proposals. And can you please say about the most common namespaces in pips? Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. So sort of the two-digit peps are meta peps. So there's like PEP 0 is the PEP index. PEP 1 is the description of the PEP writing process. And then there's a few other project level policy PEPs in there. So like PEP 13, because it's the governance model, it got a two-digit PEP number. And sort of the normal PEPs started about 200, I think. So those are language features and so forth. But at various points, there have been people who pick special PEP numbers. So for example, PEP 404 is the Python 2.8 unreleased schedule, which is about how we're not going to release Python 2.8. And there's also PEP 666, which is a great number. I don't actually remember what it's about, but and then so a lot of the Python 3 features. So sort of the code name of Python 3 was Python 3000 for a long time. So a lot of those PEPs start with 3000. And I don't remember why 8000 was picked for the governance ones, but I guess it felt like a different important category of PEP. So someone said, let's give it a new namespace.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, thanks. I'd like to ask you about how much time do you spend on Python yourself? And don't you get tired of it, and maybe periodically you seek some other language to take some features out of it? Thanks.
Yeah, so the amount of time I'm able to spend on Python varies a lot. So I have a day job programming, and sometimes I go home after the week's done and say, wow, I just spent a whole week yelling at computers. Maybe I don't need to do that at the weekend too. So probably maybe like 3, 4, 5 hours a week is average. That's as much that I can fit in. And in terms of learning from other languages, I think that's very, very, very important. I mean, I personally like to learn new languages and new technologies, and it's also very common in PEPs that we expect people to say how a particular feature shows up in other languages and why that is or isn't a good idea. And so you have to be careful when you're doing that, because sometimes features which are in other languages fit very well in the model of those languages, and if you just directly copy them into Python, it wouldn't work with sort of the Python philosophy. But it's certainly sort of shameless copying is a very important language design principle.
Yeah, thank you. More questions? Yeah, over there. Two.
Thanks. Is there any chance then PyPy becomes a reference implementation of Python?
PyPy. Okay. So I've actually worked on PyPy a bit. It's one of the most interesting projects, not only in Python but just the world of software. I think there's things in it which I've never seen anywhere else. The PyPy project is not really so much interested in guiding the evolution of the language, but is more interested in the implementation of Python and perspective optimizations, of course. And so the traditional CPython and PyPy have kind of always had sort of separate goals, I guess, as projects. So I'm not really sure how you would blend sort of the implementation focus of PyPy and the design parts of CPython, because for the most part they're sort of disjoint sets of people. I mean, you should definitely use PyPy. It's great. It should see wider adoption. But I don't think in the next few years it will become the reference implementation. It's still in Python 2.
Well, there is a PyPy 3 for the 3.5 Python.
Right, but the PyPy itself is written in Python. Our Python is Python 2. Yeah.
The last question, please.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, man. A while ago, on one of the mailing lists, I've seen a number of discussions regarding Python 4. So my question is, since we're not going to break backwards compatibility, what would be like a pivotal point to increment the major version?
So, yeah, that's a very much an open question. As far as I'm personally concerned, I think we should just not talk about Python 4. Like we should release like 3.25 and like just like Linux kernel style. Like I'm really excited for 3.14. That'll be good. Pi. But I mean, just speculating. Like some things like the people want to like redo the C API to make it easier to make things faster, because that's one of the things which makes it hard to optimize CPython is the C API. So like maybe if we majorly broke that or something, we could move to Python 4. I don't really know if that's a good idea, but yeah. So I don't want there to be a Python 4 right now.
Okay, thank you. So one last thing, you should choose the best question, and for the best questions, we're giving the certificate for the book. You can choose any at stand of our partners, DMK Press. So.
Oh, you should have told me that beforehand.
Import random.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. There were no bad questions today.
Okay. Okay, we have 4 questions. Choose any number.
3.
3. Okay. So. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have a short break. Of course, if you have more questions, you can chat with Benjamin in the hall.